Hi everybody, I'm Cindy Gates and I am the director of the IRB here at UC Davis. We're going to talk about ethics in research that involves human subjects. And you wonder, why are we talking about ethics when you're in technology? Well, there is a place for ethics in this type of research. And ethics wasn't really considered throughout the world history when research was being done, even research with human subjects. And you really need to consider the ethics because the people you involve in your research, even if you're just collecting data from them and you never even meet them, those people are giving a part of themselves to you so you can collect data and answer your research questions. They deserve the utmost respect. So let's go back to an earlier time. I mentioned that ethics wasn't a concept that was considered in world history, and so this is back in the 1700s. And if you look at your arm, most of you will not have a scar on it, but I have a scar here, and that's when I got the smallpox vaccine. I think I'm probably a little bit older than you guys. Now we don't get it, and the reason we don't get the smallpox vaccine is because smallpox is eradicated. But the history about the eradication of smallpox is really interesting. So we're going back to the 1700s and a man named Edward Jenner. And he did the first experiment that was based on immunology. And he determined that maybe he could use the body's immune system to fight against smallpox. One thing he noted was that blisters on milkmaids looked a lot like the blisters on smallpox. And so he did a little bit of research and he thought that they were chemically very similar. And so he thought maybe he could stir up a body's immune system to fight smallpox if they're inoculated with something that's not as virulent as smallpox. And he wanted to test the milkmaid's pus by injecting it into someone and to see if he got a reaction to it, and then later injecting them with the smallpox. And so he used an 8-year-old child who was the son of a gardener who worked for him. And he injected this little boy with some of the pus from a blister on one of the milkmaids. It was Mary Nelms was the name of the milkmaid. He injected that little boy, and the little boy got sick. And he was sick for 10 days. He had fever, he had nausea, he couldn't eat, he was pretty sick. But then he got well, he lived, he got better. A few months later then, Jenner injected him with real smallpox serum. And the kid didn't even get sick. And so Jenner determined then that the body's immune system had fought against the smallpox serum and that this little boy was immune to the smallpox. And people agreed with him. He was lauded. He became the king's physician. He was the man who essentially killed smallpox. It took a few years to get the whole world inoculated, but now we do not have smallpox. There's still a little bit of the virus that's in the CDC and maybe some other places in the world, but it's not in people right now. And we have Edward Jenner to thank for that. Let's look at this more carefully. He took an 8-year-old child, injected that child with the serum that he knew could be virulent enough to kill that child. And he had very little background information when he did it. The child was the son of an employee. So were they forced to do this? Did they consent to do that? Did they know what they were doing? He could have killed that child. Was this research ethical? Most people don't think it was ethical at all. But again, it did eradicate smallpox. And that's been the tension throughout history, is you can get some really good information from research, but then you have to look at the cost. And it's the cost to the person in the research that we really need to look at. You can't sacrifice one person for the good of others when you're doing research. And you always need to think about that and consider all of the issues that involves that person. Do they know what they're getting into? Do you have enough background information before you put them through something? What are their rights? Are you breaking any laws too? You need to think about that. Let's talk about another realm of studies that went through, and these seem worse. They're maybe not worse, but that's the Nazi experiments. So back during the Second World War, the Nazis had millions of people in concentration camps. And they used these people to develop medical and other technologies. They did a lot of research. They looked at the differences between twins and illnesses and psychological issues. They did bone, muscle, and nerve transplantations. They would hurt people. They would shoot people, cut off a leg, or do something like that, and then test the treatments for those injuries. They had a big problem when their pilots would ditch their airplanes into really cold water. And so they used the concentration camp people, and they dipped them in really cold water, and they developed protective clothing that would keep people from freezing. But it was the people in the concentration camps whom they tested that on, and many of them died. They would intentionally infect people with diseases. They would intentionally castrate men. They just did so much. The sterilization and fertility experiments, they gave people poison, and they just did this without even thinking that these were people who had rights and they were causing a significant amount of harm. Now, they were tried. They went on trial back in the 30s, the Nuremberg trials, if you remember, or if you've ever read about it. And their defense was that other countries were doing this too. They were doing experiments on people without the people even knowing about it. So yes, what the Nazis did was pretty atrocious. It really was. At the same time, the U.S. was conducting a syphilis experiment in Guatemala. And in that experiment, the U.S., it was funded by the Public Health Service, the U.S. injected prisoners with syphilis. Or they brought in prostitutes to infect the prisoners with syphilis. And then they tested different treatments for syphilis. They really wanted to get a cure because syphilis was a disease that was affecting the whole world at that time. And so here they used prisoners who really had absolutely no rights. They didn't really tell them what they were doing, and they intentionally gave them a deadly disease, and those men infected other people with this deadly disease, and people died during this. And that was a research funded by the U.S. government, and it was ongoing during the Nuremberg trials. So yeah, you think all of this is old stuff, and what does it matter? What about today? Do we still do things like that? And I'd love to say no, we don't do things like that. But this Guatemala study was back in the 1930s. So some of the research I'm going to talk to you about is from the 60s and 70s now. And so this is an experiment you might have heard about, you might have learned about it before, but it's the Milgram obedience to authority experiment. And what Dr. Milgram was studying was why people under Nazi control, the superiors, why did they obey the orders to do these horrible things to people? Why did they pick up people and put them in concentration camps? Why did they conform to these orders? And so Milgram set up an experiment where he advertised for people, so you can see the ad there, and then he set up where the person would come in who was actually the subject, and they would sit at a booth, and they would be told to press these buttons, and the other person that came in was supposed to be the subject or the student, and the student was supposed to deliver information. If they delivered it incorrectly, the real subject would press this button and would be told that he's given an electric shock. And on the panel, there was a really big red button, and that big red button was the ultimate shock, and it would really hurt someone if you delivered that shock. And so people would come in after they read the ad, they would come in and they would sit there, and the student or the learner would be repeating these things that they're supposed to repeat, and it would be wrong, and the person would then be told to press that shock button. And people did it. If they didn't really do it when they were supposed to, then Milgram was back there saying, please continue. the experiment requires you to continue. You need to go on. You have no other choice. You must go on. And he was back there repeating this over and over again. And it turned out that a lot of people pushed that red button, giving the ultimate shock, because that student would never say the right thing. That was the plan. He was a Confederate of Milgram. And so what's wrong with this study? You've got this person there being told to do a horrible thing to someone else. And when they do it, how do you think that makes them feel later? I mean, this could cause psychological injury to people. And so there was a big ethics issue here because the person really didn't know the whole story. They thought they were really hurting people. And they thought they were part of an experiment, but they were delivering an experiment. They weren't the subject. And so they were lied to in this. And so no consent was obtained. And then things got even better. There's another really interesting one. Laud Humphreys was considered a real expert on homosexual behavior back in the 60s. And in the 1960s, homosexuality, the act of homosexuality, was a crime. So people who were homosexual then were discriminated against harshly if they were caught performing any sexual act. And even if they did their time or whatever it was for the crime, their reputation was soiled forever. They were a persona non grata at that time. This is long ago. And so what Laud Humphreys wanted to do was just to find out what motivations they had and were they really good people or bad people? Because the feeling was they were bad people at that time. And so he would go into these buildings that were called tea room trade shops. And that is where it was like a bar or a tea shop or something where homosexuals would meet, usually homosexual men. And he would befriend them. He would act like one of them. He would even be the person, the lookout, when they would go into a bathroom maybe and engage in an act. But at the same time, he would write down their driver's license, their automobile license numbers. And he would later then look them up and go to their home and ask to speak to them and then tell them what he really was doing and try to interview them then. And so he had this information about them, and then he would arrive at their home and then try to get more information from them. Now, I imagine most of them gave the information because they felt like they'd be penalized if they didn't give. But they were deceived really through the whole thing. Now, the outcome of the study was actually very good because he learned that, believe it or not, homosexual people were normal. They were just like everybody else. They had families, they had jobs, they were very important people in some instances. And so this was kind of like a breakthrough that stopped a really bad part of our history where there was so much discrimination against homosexuality and homosexuals. So the outcome was good. But again, what about the people that he used in this research? Did he respect them? Did he take care of their welfare? Was he really out to protect their welfare when they did this? It's really devastating. I have to get personal here. I had a very dear friend he was the brother of one of my high school friends, and I actually worked with him, during the day. And he had a baby. He and his wife had a baby, and about 3 weeks later, he was arrested in a park with a lot of other men and engaged in homosexual activity. And he was released. His family then shunned him. And about 4 days after he was released, he committed suicide. So in many ways, I think Laud Humphrey was, really good for trying to help us learn more about these individuals. This guy was a great guy. But at the same time, Laud Humphreys deceived people when he did it. Could there have been a better way to do it? And so back in the 70s, this is in 1971, there was a big experiment at Stanford University, and that was the Stanford Prison Experiment. And so this one started where they put an ad in the paper, And they advertised for people to come in and be in a research study. You can see the ad on the screen over there. And they put them in a simulated prison. And it was a really good simulation. And some people were assigned to be guards, and some people were assigned to be prisoners. And about the first day, people started taking on the persona, the role that they were given. They would actually take that persona on. And within 6 days, they had to stop the study. And they had to stop the study because the guards were actually abusing the prisoners. And the people who were acting as prisoners, were getting into their own little shell and having, some really big emotional issues with it. And then when it was over, of course, these people wondered about the actions they took during the experiment. But it was stopped on the 6th day because it was getting actually violent. And then there was an outcry among the public who heard about it, thinking, why would they put people in this situation without getting a little bit more data before they did it? They should have realized the consequences. I mean, the study was to see if people would take on these personas. And so there was evidence that maybe that happened. So maybe they should have softened it down or done something to protect the people's, their safety, their rights, and also their mental health through this. And so again, this was considered an unethical type of research. So here's some quotes that people said in response to the Stanford prison experiment. I need to tell you that that experiment has been repeated by television networks, and I think by another scientist, maybe in a softer situation, but the results are kind of repeated each time. And so this is the investigator that started this study, and this is kind of what he learned, that the planned 2-week investigation into the psychology of prison life had to be ended because they really didn't understand the risks when they started this study. One more study just to tell you about, so you can just know that people's rights really were not protected back then, is there's a clinic in San Antonio where they did a study, and this is a clinical study. And poor women in Texas went to this clinic to get birth control. That's what they were there for. And the physicians there decided to do an experiment. They wanted to be authored. They wanted to write a manuscript. And so they wanted to compare different contraceptives. And so they would give the women a specific contraceptive and then give other women a placebo. A matching cohort would get placebo. They didn't obtain consent. None of the women knew that this was happening. They did get some good data, but they also got a lot of children out of this. The outcome of this study was unplanned pregnancies, and they were unplanned pregnancies to indigent women in San Antonio. So pretty soon, people got smarter. And I'm going to tell you about the Tuskegee syphilis study. You might have heard about it. Back in the 90s, President Clinton gave apologies for what we did. But this is back about the same time the Guatemala study that I discussed was going on. It was back in the 1930s. And again, the public health system funded a study to learn about syphilis. And they enrolled African American men in Alabama into this study. And they didn't tell them what was wrong with them. They told them they had bad blood. That's what they told them. Even when antibiotics were discovered and there was a treatment for syphilis, they didn't tell them about the treatment. They didn't even tell them they had syphilis. And instead, they wanted to study the life of the disease and get as much information as they could. They treated the men otherwise very well. They drove them around in limousines. They gave them meals. They even paid for their funerals. And a lot of people died in this study. And it wasn't just the men. Of course, the men infected people. The people had babies, and babies died, partners died, women died, and men died because they weren't treated for their syphilis in this study. This is an invitation for one of the treatments. And this comes from some Tuskegee archives. And it says that you're coming in for this great new treatment. And it tells them that they'll meet the limo, that they will get there, and it could be good for them, but it's because of their bad blood, is what it tells them. When in actuality, this invitation is for a spinal tap, where they're going to stick a needle in the man's back and collect some serum from the spinal column so they could do more experiments with it. There was absolutely no treatment involved. So the men who got this invitation were lied to. So think about all that. This is African American men. This started in the 30s. Now, 1972. And here's the New York Times headlines. People found out about it. So for 40 years, these syphilis victims went undertreated or untreated. And this is 1972, when the civil rights issues were really at a peak. And here the U.S. government had paid scientists to do an experiment on African American men and left them untreated. How do you think the nation reacted to that? It was a really bad time, yeah. So Congress reacted to it immediately, pretty much. They created a commission, and the commission was to find out solutions to this problem. And it wasn't just this one research, it's all this other research I was talking about. And I can stand here for 2 days probably and give you examples of some really evil and bad things that happened to people. There's a book written by Dr. Beecher that includes, I think it's about 100 experiments that are considered unethical, and this was in 1965. He couldn't even get his book published at that time because people didn't want the truth to come out. But Congress got busy in 1972, and they developed this commission, and the commission developed ethical principles which led to regulations that were enforced and are still being enforced when people conduct research with human subjects. Now, these regulations are applicable really only when you're doing research that would be funded by the federal government, but the regulations are generally accepted as the threshold for the ethical principles you need to apply when you're conducting research. And these are really based on 3 very simple principles, and they come from the Belmont Report. The first principle is respect for persons. So I've said before, when you're involving a human being in research, you're getting data about them. You might be doing things to them that could be uncomfortable or could be risky, like to their privacy or their confidentiality. Think about the Laud Humphreys experiment that we discussed. You need to respect these people that you use in your research. And you do that through giving them the information about the research. They need to know everything they want to know about the research. They need to know for sure why you're doing this research, what the risks of the research are. Will they have discomfort during the research? What will happen to the information that you gather from this research? And will they learn the outcome of the research? So you need to make sure that they get the information they need, and then you're obligated as a researcher to make sure they understand it. You need to ask them questions. Why am I asking you to do this? What's going to happen? Can you get hurt doing this? Are you going to get any benefit from this? You ask them some questions to see if they really understand. And in some instances, you might enroll people who can't even consent for themselves. Suppose you're doing research with mentally incapable adults or with children or babies. How do you respect them? Well, in those instances, the Belmont Report, the principle of respect for persons, means you should have a surrogate stand in their place who understands them or who has their safety and their welfare uppermost in their mind, make the decision. You also need to consider, can you do this research without involving people who lack the capacity to consent and lack the capacity to understand? And if they have just some capacity to understand, suppose it's an 8-year-old child and you want to have the child do some games and things and then draw some blood from the child for some reason. You need to make sure the child understands as much as that child can about what you're doing and agrees or disagrees. And you need to then respect that child's decision. If the child disagrees, then you shouldn't include that child in your research. So you make sure they understand, you make sure that they have all the information and that their decision is voluntary. And so when they decide yes or no, that's with no coercion, no undue influence. So like maybe the people in the Nazi trial said, oh yes, use me for an experiment because they promised maybe a better meal or something. Was that really voluntary? There's a lot of research in prisons that we've done. Is consent from a prisoner voluntary? What if a physician has taken care of a patient for 30 years and he tells the patient, I want you to be in this experiment with me, and he tells them all about it? Is that patient's consent really voluntary? Or would the patient think, oh, my doctor won't take care of me if I don't do this? Or my doctor knows best. My doctor knows what's best for me, so he wouldn't want me to do this if I could get hurt. When in actuality, it could be something that could hurt them. So respect for persons means you respect that person. You make sure they know what they're getting into, they understand it, and it's really voluntary. The next principle is beneficence. And to sum that one up quickly, it's don't hurt people. You need to, when you conduct your research, consider every risk, every discomfort of what you're doing. And in your type of research, it might be more risk to reputation or risk to it might be legal consequences for somebody, or it could be they might not get a job if you use information you gathered about them. But you respect that and you try to find ways to minimize it. So if you're collecting data that's sensitive about someone, how do you protect them? Then you find ways to make sure that data is not going to get into someone's hands where it shouldn't be. And so you must use encrypted electronics, or you certainly use pseudonyms instead of people's names, things like that. If you can do the research without even collecting the person's identity, that's the best way to do it too. The third one is justice, and justice has changed throughout the years. In 1970, the feeling was we're including the most vulnerable people in our research. And we need to find ways to keep them out of research and make sure only the people who can stand to be in the research are really invited to join it. And so for years we did all this research, and most of the subjects were Caucasian men, because other races or ethnicities were considered vulnerable. Women were considered vulnerable. Children were considered vulnerable. Even fetuses and embryos were considered vulnerable at that time. And so there was no research on pregnant women, no research involving children, no significant research involving these categories of subjects. And so what happened, at least in the drug industry, is we have a lot of approved drugs that work really well on Caucasian men. But they might not work on Hispanic men. They might not work on African American men the same way, because none of these races or ethnicities were included. And they certainly acted differently on women. Whereas now in research, a researcher usually, if it's federally funded, the researcher has to explain why they're not including all different categories of subjects, different races, different ethnicities, different gender, different ages, pregnant women. You have to explain why you're not including those. Another reason that the principle of justice changed so much is back when the AIDS epidemic became real in the 80s. And at that time, we were still keeping people out of research, not doing research until we're really sure about things. And so in that time, there were activists, a lot of people who either had AIDS or had loved ones with AIDS, were trying to get research opportunities more available to people who were subject to getting AIDS or who already had it. And that's kind of what started turning the tide as far as justice. So where justice was keep people out of research, now it's make everyone allow everyone to have the opportunity to be in the research. At the same time, when you're including people in your research, you need to consider, am I excluding anyone for reasons other than scientific reasons? Or am I including people for reasons other than scientific reasons? And the reason you're doing that is you need to think about, are you targeting some group because they're easy targets? Or are you looking at all the scientific issues that surround your inclusion and exclusion criteria to decide who will be in your research and who won't be in your research? You need to exclude the most vulnerable or the people who would be most harmed in your research, if at all possible. But under justice, really your decisions for your inclusion and exclusion criteria should be based on the science of your research and not on anyone's particular race, their amount of wealth, their income, their job, or whatever. So along with the Belmont report, Congress developed some regulations, and they were first codified as 45 CFR 46, and that's under the Department of Health and Human Services. And it's referred to now as the Common Rule. It's referred to as the Common Rule because other funding agencies adopted it. In fact, most funding agencies have adopted 45 CFR 46. It might be listed under different numbers or chapters, and then, or it just might refer to 45 CFR 46 in a specific regulation. But 45 CFR 46 is referred to as the Common Rule and the Human Subject Protections regulations. And so it applies really only to federally funded studies. I think I've said this earlier, but it is considered the basic threshold for people conducting research. And here at UC Davis, we apply 45 CFR 46 to all research. And I believe all the other campuses apply it too. And so it has protections that include the requirement for informed consent, and for minimizing risks and maximizing the benefits during the research. It talks a lot about there's criteria for approval that before a study can be approved, you have to meet very specific criteria. One of them for justice is selection of subjects is equitable. So you have to make sure that when you're enrolling people or developing your inclusion criteria that your selection is equitable. You have to either get informed consent. In some instances, informed consent can be waived, but those instances are pretty rare. And the biggest change there is that it required a group of people to look at your research, look at your protocol, look at your background, look at the resources that you have, and then consider all of that against 45 CFR 46 and the criteria for approval, and determine whether this research can be conducted. And that's called the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. A lot of people think of the IRB as a black hole. They send their research to it, and maybe a few months later they'll get something back. But really the IRB is a group that looks really hard at all the research submissions, and they ensure that subjects are protected, the science is valid, and that risks are minimized, benefits are optimized. And every UC campus has an IRB, and they do require review of research involving human subjects before you can start it. There was also FDA regulations. These were promulgated about 10 years later, and they include regulations very similar to the Common Rule. The little bit of differences are because the risks are usually higher in FDA research because you're looking at drugs or devices, and it's very important for the data to be correct. So you're protecting the subjects as much as possible from harm. At the same time, you're trying to make sure the data you get from this study is valid and will show if a drug is good or a drug is bad, if they're effective, what the risks are, so people can be warned. And so the data in an FDA investigation is really, really important. But it also has a specific regulation for informed consent, and it has additional protections for children. I didn't mention before, the Common Rule has additional protections for children, for prisoners, and for pregnant women and neonates. FDA has specific regulations for investigator conflict of interest. So sometimes investigators might be the inventor of a drug or a device or some other thing, and they expect maybe to make money if their research is successful. And so that can sometimes result in investigators' bias when they're looking at whether a person meets the criteria to be in the research, or even when they're evaluating the outcome of the research. They might see benefit maybe when there's not really benefit there. And so we look at investigator conflicts of interest and even research staff conflicts of interest, and we try to manage them as appropriately as much. And the IRB does that, the FDA considers that when they're looking at a drug or a device, when they're looking at the data. And so FDA regulations also include very specific regulations for involving humans in research experiments with drugs and biologics, and they also have a separate regulation for involving humans in experiments with devices. I mean, drugs and biologics can be pretty bad in some instances, and devices, if they're implantable, can be terribly bad if they're not safe and effective. And so you have to go through steps before you can even get to the human subject aspect of clinical investigation. So I've talked a lot about the regulations and the history, and so we've got these wonderful regulations where we protect everybody and the data are good, but really, does that take care of everything? And that's old news, right? All that ethical stuff, those bad things are old news. And unfortunately, it's an evolving world. And it's really not old news. Here are some more recent examples of some pretty bad things that have happened. Most of these are clinical investigations involving the FDA, but I can also tell you much about other investigations that were psychological or social behavior studies too. But these are a little bit more stirring, I think. One I was really involved in was a woman was in a gene therapy study back, I think it was around 2011. And she received edited gene through a vector. She had rheumatoid arthritis. She was in constant pain. And this was a phase 1 study. A phase 1 study is where you're just trying to see how the drug works in the body and whether the body can tolerate it. You might see a little bit about whether the drug works to cure the disease, but really it's just, will the body tolerate it? And she thought she was going to get well from this. At least that's what her husband said, which wasn't the purpose of the study at all. And so how did she get that in her mind? Was she told that, or was she really told the real reason for this research? Or did she just want to believe? You know, we don't know at this point because she died. She got an injection. She got ill. She went camping. The illness became worse, and to the point where she was infected everywhere in her body, and she died. And in this instance, it was her own doctor who enrolled her in the study. She had been seeing this doctor for many years, and he was the one enrolled. And so that might have a little bit of effect on her belief that she would get well from this study. So did she go into the study knowing the risks, knowing the discomfort she might have endured, and knowing that she could really die in this study? And we don't really know at this point what she believed. Another study was a young man, and he had a genetic disorder, and his really wasn't very bad. His was controlled. And he decided to go into research, though. When he turned 18, he signed up for a study, and it was another gene transfer study. And that's where they edit a gene and they get it into the body. And in this study, it was a little bit different because one of the physicians that was on the study and that was providing care to him had a financial interest in that gene therapy test article, the thing they were injecting into him. And so if this turned out to be good, that physician could make a lot of money off of that experiment. And unfortunately, it turned out to be bad. This young man who went into the study to help others and not really help himself ended up dying. And there was a little bit more data about the effect of the drug on animals that maybe people didn't look at closely. But there's also this conflict of interest. There's a few other stories on here, and I don't want to bore you by going over all of them and stuff, but look at the slides, and you might want to look up some of the results of these studies and actually see what happened in these to know the ethical consequences that people could face. So, again, that's all interesting. I was kind of focusing on the clinical stuff just so you can see the gravity of what can happen when research goes wrong. But let's look a little bit about the technology research and see. So here's the Encore study. So Encore collected information about how web users experience censorship. And so if you were in the study, and you didn't know you were in the study, but if you were in the study, you would go to this website, and that website would attempt to get you to go to another website that was censored. And in the background, they collected information about you. And so you didn't know it was happening, and they were making assumptions about your behavior and your psyche from that. Researchers collected data from 3.9 million users over only 17 days. And they associated self-censorship behavior with features describing their users. So if the person self-censored and didn't stay on that website or didn't click to go onto that website, they made assumptions about that person, their behavior, and the way they interact with people and stuff like that. And they collected other data about that person. And no one knew. No one knew that this was happening to them. So if you're sitting there browsing on the web, you wonder how many people are collecting data about you. Just think about that all the time. So Facebook users were a lot of this. They were not informed. They did not get consent. Again, they did not know this was happening. Is this study ethical? And there's been a lot of debate about that. It's like when you go onto these public websites, you should just assume that people are looking at you. But what about little children? What about, people are just uninformed. They might be surfing the web and doing things, and they just don't know that they're being watched by 1,000, 1 million big brothers out there. Now we're going to talk about the Facebook study, and you might have heard about this one. So in this one, again, there was 700,000 Facebook users were involved in this study. And so they had two groups. One group would receive more positive message from their friends, and some of the negative messages just wouldn't show up. They were censored, essentially. And there was another control group where their messages were not altered at all. And this group, these two groups, were compared to another group where the positive messages were censored out and they got more negative information from people who posted to them. And so they wanted to see how that affected people's psyche, and it turned out people who received more positive messages posted more positive messages. People who posted more negative messages, they would then post more negative messages. And so there was, something valuable learned about this, that maybe we can control people a little bit, their moods and emotions, by posting more positive or more negative messages to them. But again, 700,000 people had their Facebook usage altered. They didn't receive posts from people that they would normally receive posts from. And then they were also watched. They were observed then to see how they would react to it. And was that ethical? Is it safe? I guess. So they weren't informed. They did not consent. So they weren't respected, as you're supposed to respect your subjects. And then following this, there were some people who really thought deeply about it. So what's disturbing? Could the CIA change our behavior in this? Could it be used for political purposes, to run up to elections, or to encourage people to stay on a site by feeding them with happy thoughts? So other people thought that perhaps changing people's behavior all through websites, or their emotions through websites, could be used for political purposes and run up to elections. It could make people vote a certain way. It could make people not vote. It could make people buy things that they wouldn't ordinarily buy. You could just change people's behavior by manipulating them through Facebook. So yeah, these ethics are important. And what do you do with what I've taught you? How are you going to use this in the future? So let's look at some real-time things that could happen. A lot of people use Google Earth right now. Now, what if Google Earth didn't use these 3-year-old photos or 5-year-old photos, and instead, when you looked at Google Earth, you saw real-time photos? And these photos showed people doing things. And it's from satellites, Big Brother's watching again. Well, you could go on Google Earth and make assumptions about people by watching that. And we have the technology to do that. The NSA right now records a lot of people doing things in their everyday life. So research could be used or could be done using those data, and they wouldn't then get consent and things like that. How could that affect people? Could it harm people? What if Google Earth is used, it's all real time, and what if they show a bank robbery or they show an accident or a murder or something? It could affect people, and it's good if people are caught doing those things, but at the same time, other people doing maybe not such bad things are also being watched when they do it, if this would take effect. And so under the principles from the Belmont report, first is respect for persons. If you want to do research like that where you're watching people, how do you respect people and do that? How do you protect their rights, protect their welfare, and their safety? It could be impossible, but you would have to think long and hard if that's the type of research you wanted to do. Right now, in our IRB, we look at research where individuals wear cameras. You have these wearable things, and a lot of them have cameras that it's in their clothes, and they're walking through a park or walking through a store, and they are recording people when they do that, and they might even get audio recordings when they do that, and no one knows. And there is research ongoing right now that does that. Most of the research is just looking at the experiences of the individual wearing the clothes, but then there's all these other people that they're recording and photographing that we need to protect their rights just as well as we're protecting the person who's wearing the clothes. So that's kind of similar to the Google Earth thing. There's also a lot of experiments going on right now just with GPS or with other apps that people use that record data of bodily functions. They record conversations. They could record like just a heart rate and GPS. Put those two together and you can find out a lot about people. And you can do that if the apps have data in the cloud, and you could get vendors to give you some of that data in a de-identified manner. But is that respecting the individuals from whom those data were derived? You got to think about that. And justice. What if you go into just very specific neighborhoods when you're recording things or wearing the wearable cameras and stuff? So you look at the justice issue, you look at the respect, and then you minimize the risk. You don't want to cause anyone harm when you're doing these types of things. So with all of our electronic gear we can wear, we can carry around, we can attach to our body and collect all these data, how do we protect the rights of the individual who's actually performing everything, and then those around them who might just be secondary subjects who have no idea stuff is going on? So remember, you need to treat human research participants with the utmost respect. Minimize the risks when you do research, and include and exclude subjects only for scientific reasons, not because they're convenient. Questions to ask yourself: is the social media public or private? What do people think when they're using this social media? What about informed consent? Is there a way you can get informed consent? You could notify them on the website. What about the individual's anonymity? Is there a way you can keep them anonymous? Not show their face, not give enough information where someone could identify them? And could this research somehow result in harm to the individual? Could it be psychological harm? Could it be legal risk? Reputational harm? What about their job? Is there a way they could lose their job because of something you've recorded about them? And then what about their family? So you really need to think about all of these issues whenever you're writing your protocols and starting your research project. So I hope I've convinced you that the ethical principles apply when you're doing research involving technology. if in the future you do research that involves human subjects, you must go to your IRB and get approval before you start your research. And you should look on the IRB's website or contact the IRB to find out exactly how you're supposed to do it. You can also get help from the IRB when writing your protocol so that you put the principles that we've learned about into your research and protect the human beings when you're conducting your research so that no one is harmed and everyone's rights are respected.